Hey guys, welcome to this complete Angular tutorial. Angular is a full-fledged JavaScript front-end framework used to create single-page applications. Applications like Gmail, Upwork, Nike, and Forbes, among others, are built using Angular. Now there's a great demand for Angular developers in the market today. So if you wish to learn Angular, then you're in the right place. This complete tutorial will introduce to you the fundamental concepts of this framework. First, we'll start off by understanding what exactly Angular is. Then, I'll help you create a simple Hello World application and teach the basic file system and libraries of the application. Then, we'll learn about the basic building blocks of Angular, that is components. After that, we'll dive into advanced topics like Angular dependency injection, forms, services, Angular Bootstrap, and Angular routing. After that, we'll compare Angular with other front-end JavaScript libraries like React and Vue. And lastly, I'll present to you Angular interview questions that will help you crack your next interview. But before we begin, if you haven't subscribed to our channel already, make sure to click the subscribe button and the bell icon to never miss an update. In this session, we're going to cover the topic of what is Angular. I'm sure all of you use mobile and web applications. Be it from social media to healthcare, e-commerce, and net banking, these apps are used by billions of people across the globe. Now, the main reason we use these apps is that they offer seamless user experience and interface. But how are they developed to provide such reliability? One of the frameworks that is widely used to build such robust apps is Angular. So let's dive into the session now. So here is a list of topics that we're going to be covering. First up, we'll see why Angular was introduced. Then what is Angular? Features of Angular, Angular architecture, advantages and limitations of Angular, the learning curve of Angular, and finally we'll look at some of the companies that deploy Angular. So without further delay, let's begin. Why Angular? Now, JavaScript is the most commonly used client-side scripting language. It is written into HTML documents, enabling interactions with web pages in many unique ways. So, as a relatively easy to learn language with almost pervasive support, it is exceptionally well suited to develop modern applications. But the question arises, is JavaScript ideal for developing single-page applications that require modularity, testability, and other features? Perhaps not. However, we have a variety of frameworks and libraries designed to help us with such things. With respect to front-end development, Angular and JavaScript together bring in structure and consistency to your web applications and also provide scalability and maintainability. Angular is specifically developed for single-page applications. So now the question arises, what exactly is Angular? Angular is an open-source JavaScript framework written completely in TypeScript. Now it was primarily aimed to develop single-page applications and is maintained by Google. Angular as a framework provides a few advantages while also providing a standard structure for developers. It is designed for web, desktop, and mobile platforms. Now, if you have a doubt here as to what exactly single-page applications are, let me help you with that. Now, these single-page applications are basically applications that get loaded just once. So the main page gets loaded onto your browser. So any further interactions does not lead to loading of subsequent pages. Anything that has to be done further is just an addition to the already loaded page. So these single-page applications are primarily developed using Angular. Moving ahead, let's look at the features of Angular. We have 4 features that we're going to be discussing. We have the document object model, TypeScript, data binding, and testing. Now let's look at them one by one. Now the document object model treats an XML or an HTML document as a tree structure. Now here every node in the tree structure defines an object representing a part of your document. Angular uses the regular DOM. Now let's suppose you've made 10 updates on a single HTML page. So every time you make a change, the corresponding DOM or the tree structure needs to be updated. Now, Angular updates the entire tree structure of HTML tags. Moving on to our next feature, we have TypeScript. Now, TypeScript defines a set of types to JavaScript, which helps you write JavaScript that is easier to understand. Now, all the TypeScript code compiles down to basic JavaScript that can run smoothly on any platform. Now, TypeScript is not mandatory for developing an Angular application, but it is highly recommended. The main reason it's highly recommended is that it offers better syntactic structure while making the code base easier to understand and maintain. Now, TypeScript can be installed as an npm package. Now, to do that, you just have to run the command npm install -g TypeScript on your command prompt. Next up is data binding. Now, data binding is a process that allows you to manipulate web page elements using the web browser. Now, it mainly employs dynamic HTML and does not require complex scripting or programming. It is used in web pages that include interactive components like calculators, tutorials, games, etc. Now, incremental display of a web page makes data binding extremely convenient when pages contain a large amount of data. When it comes to Angular, it uses two-way data binding. So any changes made in the UI element is reflected in the corresponding model state. And conversely, any changes made in the model state are reflected onto the UI state. Now, this allows the framework to connect the DOM to the model data via the controller. The last feature we're discussing is testing. Angular uses Jasmine to run its various tests. The Jasmine framework allows various functionalities to write different kinds of test cases. Karma is a task runner for the tests that use a configuration file to set the startup, reporters, and testing framework. So with that, we've covered the features of Angular. So let's go ahead and understand the architecture of Angular. Now, Angular is a full-fledged MVC framework. It provides a strong opinion on how the application should be structured and offers bidirectional data flow and updates the real DOM. MVC, short for Model View Controller, is an architectural pattern that separates the application layer into model, view, and controller. Now, model here relates to all the data-related logic. View, on the other hand, is used for UI logic of the application. And controller is the brain of the setup. Now, it is an interface between the model and view. Moving on, let's look at the advantages of Angular. First up, we have custom components. Angular allows you to build your own components that can pack functionality along with rendering logic into reusable pieces. Data binding. As discussed, Angular allows you to effortlessly move your data from your JavaScript code to the view and react to user events without having to write any code yourself. Dependency injection. Angular allows you to write modular services and have them injected wherever they are needed. This greatly improves the testability and reusability of the same. Don't worry if you can't wrap your head around these topics. We're going to discuss them further in the coming videos. Next advantage is testing. Angular has been built from the ground up with testability in mind. You can literally test every part of your application. Comprehensive. Angular is a full-fledged framework and provides out-of-the-box solutions for server communication, routing, and more. Lastly, we have excellent browser compatibility. Angular is cross-platform and browser compatible. An Angular application can typically run on all browsers, be it Chrome, Firefox, Safari, and platforms like Windows, macOS, and Linux. Now, many versions of Angular have been released ever since its inception. All of these versions have added to the efficient working of the framework. Now, here are the different versions released. First up was Angular 1. It was built on JavaScript and completely based on controllers. Next release was Angular 2. Now, this incorporated the component-based approach, wherein the entire UI was divided into several components and lastly integrated to give the final logic. Next was Angular 4. It included router updation. Angular CLI or Command Line Interface 1.0 was introduced, however not deployed. In this release, the Angular CLI was optimized and commands like ngupdate and ngadd were added. In the Angular 7 release, prompts were introduced which provided tips in CLI about the functions being used. In Angular 8, IV renderer and Bazel were introduced. And finally, the most recent release was Angular 9. Now this came with the better framework and Angular material. Now this completely switched to the IV renderer as a default compiler. Now that we've learned about the pros of using Angular, let's look at some of the limitations of Angular. First up is a steep learning curve. Now since Angular is a complete full-fledged framework, it becomes difficult for learners to begin with. You need to be acquainted with simple topics and then move on to more advanced topics to become proficient in this language. Next up is limited SEO options. Now, Angular offers limited SEO options and poor accessibility to search engine crawlers. It's verbose and complex. Now, a common issue faced by the Angular community is the verbosity of the framework. It also poses to be complex compared to other front-end tools. And lastly, migration. Now, one of the drawbacks of Angular is poor migration. Now, it becomes difficult to port legacy code to Angular-style architecture. Also, with each new release, it is painful to upgrade and a lot of them are not backward compatible. Next up, let's look at the Angular learning curve. Now, if you wish to learn Angular, you need to be acquainted with basic topics in Angular. Some of them are directives, modules, decorators, components, services, dependency injection, pipes, and templates. Now, once you've mastered your basics, you will want to go and understand more advanced topics such as change detection, zones, AOT compilation, and rx.js. However, the learning curve of Angular is clear-cut. In the beginning, it could be a little intimidating, but once you start using the tool, it becomes way more easier to comprehend and understand what is going on. And lastly, let's look at some of the companies that use Angular today. Many top-tier companies like Nike, Forbes, Google, HBO, Sony, Upwork, among others, readily deploy Angular. So moving on, let's look at the prerequisites for Angular. First up, we have Node.js. Angular uses Node.js as its base for a large part of its build environment. So as a result, to get started with Angular, you will need to have Node.js installed on your environment. So head to their official website and download the latest release for your corresponding operating system. Next up is the Angular CLI. Now this command line interface is a tool that makes it easier to bootstrap and develop your Angular applications. Now to install the latest version, run the command npm install-g at angular/CLI. You gotta run this command on your command prompt. And finally, to confirm installation, check for its version. Now the next thing that you will need is an IDE or a text editor to type your code. Now there are several IDEs that you can choose from. But in this series, we've used VS Code throughout. So it is available on all platforms. So go ahead and download it if you haven't already. Now moving on to the final part is the demo. Now that you have a basic understanding of Angular and its prerequisites, I think you're ready to create your first Angular application. So let's head to our VS Code and begin. Here I've created a folder called Angular on my desktop and opened it on my Visual Studio Code. So to create your app, you need to open the terminal. Just go here and select New Terminal. And now type in the command ng new and provide the name for your app. So I'm just going to say hello world. So now this is going to create, just say yes. So basically what happens is that when you run the command, it will automatically generate a skeleton application under the folder that is hello world in our case. And it includes a bunch of files and installs all the necessary dependencies for the Angular application. So this could take a while. So once you've created your application, to run it, first change the directory. So let's say cd hello world. And now use the command ng serve. Now once it's compiled, you need to go to your browser and type in localhost 4200. And once you do that, you can see your UI. You can see that the application has been loaded onto your browser and it says Hello World app is running. So this is how you create your application. So let's go back to our VS Code. Now as you can see here, there are many files and folders that are created, right? So let's look at a few of them. Of course, we can't explain everything, but I'll brush through a few of them. So the first main component is basically the root component. Now the root component here is the index.html. So here, if you open the file and see, it's a very small crisp code, right? But the most important thing in the file is this app root element. So what this does is it's basically the marker for loading your application code. So this is extremely important. So the next important file is the main.ts. Now this is the part of the bootstrapping piece. Alright, so the index.html file is responsible for deciding which files are to be loaded, correct? The main.ts file on the other hand identifies which Angular module is to be loaded when the application starts. So this is just a brief explanation as to what they are doing. Next we have the app folder. Now here we have the app.module.ts file. Now this application module file can be thought of as the core configuration of your application. So here's where the source code starts from. And moving on, we have the app.component.ts. So these are all TypeScript files, hence the extension TS. Now this file basically is the root component of your application. And then we have the HTML file for the same, which defines the appearance of what you can see on your browser. So let me just change the message that is being displayed. So I'll say, hey, welcome to this Angular tutorial. So let's save this. And when we go back to our browser, we can see the message, hey, welcome to this Angular tutorial being displayed. So like this, we can make a simple change and then it gets rendered onto your browser. So this was just a brief explanation of what happens in the background of your application. First, we'll get acquainted to what exactly Angular components are. Then I'll help you create an Angular component by showing a quick demo. And lastly, we'll learn about component decorator metadata. But before we begin, make sure to subscribe to our channel if you love watching new and interesting technology videos. Also, hit the bell icon to never miss an update. So what exactly are Angular components? Now I'm sure everybody uses web applications. And one of the most widely used applications is Gmail, correct? Now to help you understand what components are, consider them as Lego blocks. Now they basically are combined together to form the final application. So in this case, here we have the logo component, then you have a sign-in component, an image component, and then a create account component. Now all of these components generally don't affect the working of each other. But however, when embedded, they define the UI of your application. So I hope you understood what components are. So to go ahead, let's discuss some of its common features. Now firstly, they are the building blocks of an application. Generally, you have a root component, which is basically the app component, and then it branches out into other components, creating a hierarchy. And these components are a subset of directives. Now don't worry about what directives are because we'll cover them later on in the series. But to give you an idea, there are three types of directives. You have the structural directives, the attribute directives, and the component directives. Only one component can be instantiated per element in a template. Now components are typically custom HTML elements, and each of these elements can instantiate only one component. Now don't worry, you'll understand this better when I show you the demo. Nextly, a TypeScript class is used to create a component. Now this class is then decorated with the @component decorator. Now the decorator accepts a metadata object that gives information about the component. Now a component must belong to the ng module in order for it to be usable by another component or application. And finally, components control their runtime behavior by implementing lifecycle hooks. So this was just a brief introduction to what Angular components are. Now you will only be able to understand the working of components when I show it to you practically. So let's head over to our Visual Studio Code. Now here, back in my VS Code, I've created a folder called Angular Demo, within which I've created an Angular application called Demo Components. Once executed, the browser looks something like this. So if you haven't watched our previous video on getting started with Angular, that is Angular Hello World, I highly suggest you go through that video first. It helps you create your first Angular application. So now let's go ahead and create our first component. Now the command used to create our component is ng-gc and your component name. Once executed, it creates 4 different files. Now let's just see how this works on our VS Code. Now what you can do is head to your terminal and type in the command ng-gc and provide a name for your component. For example, I'm going to just call my component text component. Alright. So what it does is that it creates 4 different files. You can see you have 4 different files that have been created, and finally it updates the file that is app.module.ts, indicating that this new component has been created. So here in your source folder, within which there's an app folder, and again here you can see that your 4 different files have been created. First is the HTML file, wherein you can define all the code that you want for your component. Next, you have the CSS file for your styling. Then you have the .ts file, which includes the component decorator. And finally, you have spec.ts, which is basically a unit test file. Alright. And then in your app.module.ts, you can observe that the component that you've created, that is text component, has been imported. That is what the message conveys here. Alright, now let's go back to our app.component.html. Now this basically has all the code for your application, so let me just get rid of it. And I'm just gonna display a basic heading saying hello, welcome. Alright, so let me save it. And if you go ahead and look at your browser, hello, welcome message is displayed. Now let's go back to our component.html file. And here, let me provide a message. Let me say h3 and let me display a message saying welcome to this tutorial on Angular components. Alright. Now in your text component.ts file, which is your TypeScript file, the selector mentioned here is app-text component. Now go ahead and copy this. And in your final component.html, go ahead and create your custom HTML tag with the selector that you just copied. Now this indicates that the component that you just created, that is the text component, is being incorporated in the final render. So what happens is that whatever is defined in the component.html file is also being rendered in your final output. So when I save this, let's go ahead and check our browser. You can see that the message welcome to this tutorial on Angular components is displayed. So this was a simple creation of a component. Now for this, let's give it some styling. So here, go to your .css file and provide some styling. Say for example here, I just say text align. And let me say center. And also in my app.component.cs, I'm going to give the same thing. I'll say h1 text align is center. Alright, so let me save this and there we go. Now we can also create multiple components and define the tags in the app component. Now the components are executed sequentially. So now let's create another component just to give you a brief insight into it. Let's say ng-gc image component. Now here I'm going to be adding the Simplilearn logo. So I'll show you how that works. Now you can see that a new component has been created with 4 files again. So in my assets folder here, I've added the logo. So what I can do is back in my HTML file, I can go ahead and create an image tag. So first, let me just display another message here just to avoid any confusion. And let me say this is the image component. And then let me say image source equals, so the source is basically assets / logo .png and class equals center. Alright, so you can also head to your CSS file and provide any sort of styling that you need. So let me just say text align to be center, and then let's create a styling for the image, and here I mentioned the code for the image. So let's save this, and from the .cs file let's copy the selector and create a custom HTML tag in our final component.html file. So there we go. Let's save this and check the output, and there we go. First, the hello welcome message is displayed. Next, you have the message displayed from the first component, and then you have the second component. So this is how you can create your own components, and don't forget to incorporate these selectors into your final HTML file. So moving on to our next topic, component decorator metadata. Now, as mentioned earlier, the @component decorator accepts a metadata object that provides information about the component. Correct? Here is a list of properties of the metadata object. First up is the selector. Now, basically, the selector is a CSS selector that identifies this particular component in a template. Now, this corresponds to the HTML tag that is included in the parent component. You can create your own HTML tag. However, the same has to be included in the parent component. So to help you understand that better, let's head back to our VS Code and say, for example, in our text component here, the selector says text component, correct? For the time being, let's change it to say n component. All right. Now, when you save it and look at the browser, the message is not displayed. So what we can do is you can copy this selector and then include this here. And now you can see that the same component has been rendered onto your output. All right. So the selector plays a crucial role in that. Next up, we have the template. Now, a template is an inline defined template for the view. Now, the template can be used to provide some particular markup. The markup could typically include some headings or paragraphs that are displayed on the UI. Next up, we have template URL. Now, it is the URL for the external file containing the template for the view. So here you can see, this is basically the external file that contains the template for the view. Next up, you have styles. Now, these are also inline defined styles that can be applied to the components view. So any code that you provide in the .css file can also be included here. Next, you have the style URLs. Now, this is a list of URLs to your style sheets that are applied on your components view. Next up, you have providers. Now, this is again an array where certain services can be registered for your component. Lastly, we have animations. As the name suggests, these are animations that can be listed for your components. First, we'll understand what exactly dependency injection is. Then we'll understand the demerit or the drawback of not using dependency injection. Then we'll understand dependency injection as a design pattern. And finally, I'll help you understand the entire concept with the help of a demo. So let's begin. What exactly is dependency injection? So let's consider this. I'm sure you're aware that Angular uses the concept of components. The entire UI of the application is divided into several components. Now, what if all of these components perform similar tasks, be it accessing the database, rendering images, etc.? Now, instead of writing the same piece of code for every component, you could write the code once and then perhaps inject the same code into every component. Now, this is supported by dependency injection. Now to give you a better example, consider two classes A and B. Now let's assume that A uses the objects of class B, and normally in object-oriented programming, an instance of class B is created so that A can access its objects. But using dependency injection, we move the creation and binding of dependent objects outside of the class that depend on them. So dependency injection or DI keeps the code more flexible, testable and mutable. Also, classes can inherit external logic without having to create on its own. And lastly, DI benefits directives, pipes and components. Next up, let's have a look at the drawback of not using dependency injection. Now let's consider class postal details that is dependent on the number and the address class. In the postal details class, the constructor creates copies of the number and address. So when you instantiate a new postal details class, the constructor instantiates a unique number and address. Now although this looks simple, there's a problem with this code. Let's assume that the number and address class constructors now accept parameters. When we change the numbers class, the postal details class gets broken. Now to overcome this, what we need to do is we need to pass parameter to the number constructor. So this applies to address as well. The first drawback of using this traditional method is that the code is not very flexible. Anytime the dependencies change, the postal details class needs to be changed as well. And the second drawback is that the code is not suitable for testing. Once you instantiate the new postal details class, you get the same number and address. Even if you change the number and address classes every time, what if these classes are in turn dependent on other classes? Then it's going to be a chain reaction. So to overcome this, we make use of dependency injection. Now let's look at DI as a pattern. Dependency injection, as you all know, is a coding pattern where a class receives its dependencies from an external source rather than creating them on its own. So here in the above example, we have moved the definition of dependencies from inside the constructor to the constructor's parameters. So the postal details class doesn't create the dependencies anymore. It just consumes them. So the postal dependencies class doesn't create the dependencies anymore. So with that, we overcome the drawbacks of not using DI. So now that you know what exactly dependency injection is and how vital it is, let's look at a simple demonstration to understand the concept better. Now, services, classes, modules, components, all of these are benefactors of dependency injection. So in the demo, I'm going to be showing how dependency injection can be used with the help of services and injecting these services into classes. So the main thought behind this is normally components are used to ensure just a good user experience. These components do not generally execute tasks. So to execute these tasks, we make use of services. So a component can delegate tasks like fetching data from the server, any network related issues, etc. to a particular service. And these services can be made available to components. With the same thought, what I'm going to be doing is I'll be creating a service that performs the task of displaying an employee list. Later, we're going to inject this service into the class using dependency injection. So let's head to our Visual Studio Code for the demonstration. Alright, so as discussed, I'll have to first create a component that displays a button for the employee, and then I have to create a service class and inject it into my component. Now this service holds the employee details such as name, employee ID, email ID, etc. So first let's go ahead and create a component. So here let me just type nggc and the name of the component I'm providing is minfo.
If getting your learning started is half the battle, what if you could do that for free? Visit SkillUp by Simplilearn. Click on the link in the description to know more.
Alright, so as you can see here in my app folder, I have the component with 4 different files. Alright, so the next thing we have to do is we have to create a service. So to create that, we make use of the command nggs. You can either give S or service, and the service name I'm providing is records. So let me just say records here. Alright, here you can see two files are created. There is a spec.ts file and the .ts file. Alright, so now the service contains all the employee data that needs to be displayed. Right, so let's go ahead and write the data. So first we're going to make use of 3 arrays. I'm going to be displaying employee records for 3 employees. So I'll have to create 3 arrays and provide certain information. So let's go ahead and do that. Alright, so the array I'm creating is called info1 for the first employee. And I'm going to be passing information like name, employee ID and the email ID. So the array is of type string, and within which, let me just mention the details. I'm giving random information. I'm just saying Adam Taylor and some random employee ID, and let's say at@abc.net. Alright, so I'm going to be creating 3 records, so I'll just copy the same thing and paste for the rest too. Let's just change here, provide a different name here. And same for the last one. And let me change the name of the array as well. Alright, so with the agenda to retrieve this data in our component, we make use of the method for the same, right? So this method returns the employee data. So let's go ahead and create this method. I'm going to call it getInfo and then just say string, and then this will just return this .info1. Alright, I'm going to be calling it getInfo1 for better understanding. Same for the rest too as well. I'm just going to return different arrays here. Alright, and lastly info3. Alright. Now in order to retrieve this information in our component, we need 3 more arrays, right? 3 more arrays that will receive this data. Let's go back to our component.ts file here and then type in the following code. So I've created 3 arrays again. Info received 1, 2 and 3. Now what we need to do is we have to accept the information that is being sent from the service, correct? Now as I mentioned, services are implemented with the help of dependency injection. So what we need to do is we'll have to first import the service into the component.ts file. The key reason behind doing this is that when Angular creates this component, an instance of the service class is also made to perform the necessary tasks. Correct? So let's go ahead and just import it here. So I'll say import records service from and let's say records.service. Alright, and what we have to do next is that we must also declare this instance that is being created in the providers array of the component. Alright, so let's just say providers and then say records service. Alright, now we've created the instance of this class, right? However, to access this instance, an object is also created. So this object will in turn access the methods and variables of the service class. So for that, we have to create another object. So let's do that here in our constructor method. Let's say constructor private. And the object I'm creating is called our service. You can give a name of your choice. And then I'm going to just say records service. Alright, now this object will help me retrieve data from the service. So let's go ahead and use this in order to get the employee details. Alright, so I've created 3 different methods here: get info from service class 2, 1 and 3. And these methods will retrieve the data and add it to our array here, that is info received. Alright, and lastly, we'll have to create an unordered list in our HTML file here. We haven't added anything, so let me get rid of this. So now I have to create 3 different buttons for 3 different employees, and when the user clicks on the button, the data is retrieved from the service and then displayed on the UI, right? So as you can see, I've created buttons for 3 different employees, and then I've made use of a Bootstrap class called list group info, and then I've interpolated info, which displays the contents of the info variable. Alright, now in order to call the methods in the .ts file, we have to bind them with the button. So since it is bound with the click event, every time you click on the button, the information is displayed. So now the last thing we have to do is we'll have to create a custom HTML tag for the component and then add it to the main component. So let's just do that. Let me copy this here. And then in my app component.html, let me get rid of this. And then let me just create this. I've just created the custom HTML tag for my component. And now just to beautify the code, I'll write a heading. And let's say employee details. And then I'll also add the Simplilearn logo, say image source. I've added the image here, so let me just say logo.png. I've also added some styling to it. Alright. So now let me just save this and have a look at the browser. So here we go. We have the logo here and then employee details heading. And then we have 3 different buttons created, that is employee 1, 2 and 3. And when I click on it, the information of the employee is displayed, the name, the ID and their email address. So yeah, so this is how you can make use of dependency injection and inject a service class into a component. So dependency injection plays a crucial role in Angular. We'll understand what Angular forms are. Then we'll look at the different types of form building supported by Angular. Next up, we'll get acquainted with features like form control and group control. And we'll learn all of this with the help of a simple demo. So without further ado, let's begin. So what exactly are Angular forms? Now I'm sure every application that you use comes with certain amount of form filling, correct? Be it your login credentials or your sign up forms or any sort of registration forms, etc. So forms are an integral part of a web application. You need forms to update your profile or to enter sensitive information, or also to perform any sort of data related tasks. So now let's look at the different types of form building supported by Angular. First up, Angular supports 2 types of form building. First, you have the template driven approach, and second, you have the reactive approach. Now let's look at them one by one. So talking about template driven approach, in this method, the conventional form tag is used to create forms. So Angular automatically interprets and creates a form object with the help of the directives. Now controls can be added to the form using the ng model tag. Now multiple controls can be grouped using the ng control group module. So it basically uses several module classes to provide controls. Now if you don't get this, don't worry, you'll understand better when I'm showing you the demo. Next up is JSON values. So form value can be generated using the form.value object. Form data is exported as JSON values when the submit method is called. Lastly, basic HTML validations can be used to validate the form fields. In the case of custom validations, directives can be used. So arguably, this method is the simplest way to create an Angular form. So moving on to reactive approach. Now this approach is the programming paradigm revolving around data flows and propagation of change. Now with reactive forms, the component directly manages the data flows between the form controls and the data models. Now reactive forms are code-driven unlike template-driven approach. Reactive forms eliminate the anti-pattern of updating the data model via two-way data binding. So it does not use two-way data binding. And typically, a reactive form control creation is synchronous and can be unit tested with synchronous programming techniques. So now, let's go ahead and look at form control and form group. So consider a typical form consisting of fields like name, age, and location. Now, a form control is basically a class that enables validation of these fields. For each input field, an instance of this class is created. Now, these instances help check the values of the field and see if they're either touched, untouched, dirty, pristine, valid, invalid, and so on. So this allows you to check every field for the value. It makes it easier to understand which field's value is invalid or which field has not been entered, etc. Now moving on to form group. So a form group class represents a group of controls. A form can have multiple group controls. The form group returns true if all the controls are valid and provides validation errors if there are any. So I hope this was clear. So moving ahead, let's look at the demo to explain all of these features. I'm sure it will become extremely clear once you look at the demo. So for that, let's head to our VS Code. So back in my VS Code, I've created a component called form component, and I've also included the Simplilearn logo just to beautify the appearance. So once you execute the code, this is what you're going to see on your browser. So you just have the logo at the moment. The first thing we need to do is we'll have to import the forms module. All right. So, but before we begin, let me tell you what the use case is. So we're going to be creating a user registration form, which is going to include 4 fields. That is the first name, last name, email ID, and a password. All right. So now let me show you how to import the forms module. So in your main app.module.ts file, you'll have to import forms module from Angular Forms. All right. And then in your imports, you'll have to just call it here. All right. So this is just a simple step. And now once you're done with that, let's go ahead and start our form creation. So here in my component.html, let's enclose the entire form within a div tag. So here, let me say div class is a container within which let me just have one heading which says user registration. All right. And now let's go ahead and create our form. So first, let me just say form. Now I'm going to create a div class for every field. So say div class equals form group. I'll explain it to you a little later. Now first let's create a label. So label tag for, basically it's the first name. So let me just say first name. And the tag will basically have first name again. All right, and let me just break the line. Next we have the field. So let's say input. Type is text. Name is first name. And we have a class which is the form control class. Alright. So this we have to do for all the other fields. So let me just copy this and paste it like 4 times. I'll also add the tag pre for spacing. Let's do that here. And finally, we'll have the button. So let's just add that here with a type submit. And let's just say submit on the button. So now let's go ahead and change these values here. So here let me just change it to last name. Here as well. And here as well. And in this case it is going to be email. So let me just change it here. And finally we have password. So let's add that here. Alright, so let's save this and just have a look at our browser. So there we go. We have our user registration form ready, but I would like to align it to the center. So let me just do that. So here in my CSS file, I'm just going to align all the div tags to the center and the label tag to the left. So let me save this and look at the browser now. And there we go. We have our registration form with a logo. So this is how you create a simple form. Now we'll have to add a directive called ngModel. Now this directive, when added into the input tag, will provide form controls to every input field. Alright, so here let's just go ahead and say ngModel. That is it. So let me just copy this and paste it for every other field. Alright, let me save this. And back in my browser, let me inspect. And here you can see different types of classes like ng-untouched, ng-pristine, ng-valid are added. Right? So this indicates that Angular has recognized the form tag and it has added these classes to the form as well as all the fields. So this is achieved when you add the ngModel directive in your input tag. Now, back in my VS Code. Now every form has an output property attached to it called ngSubmit. Alright, so this property can be bound within a method called the submit method. So once submitted, this method is called, right? So once we click on the submit button, this method has to be called. So to include that, we'll have to just say form ngSubmit equals submit. Alright, so now we have to define the submit method in our component.ts file. So here, let me just go to our component.ts file and let me just get rid of unnecessary code here. And let's define a function called submit. And then here, let me just console log form submitted. Alright, so let me just get rid of this as well. It's unnecessary here. Let's save this. So what it means is that every time you click on the submit button, this method is called. Alright, so let's just have a look at the browser. So first let's go to our console. And when I click on submit, it says form submitted. Alright. So the next crucial step is to generate JavaScript representation. Now we'll have to make use of another directive called ngForm that is assigned to a template variable. Okay, so this JavaScript representation helps with validating all the fields. So I'll help you understand that better. So back in our HTML file, let's just create a variable first. Let's call it login. Alright, and say ngForm. Okay, now the ngForm object includes the JavaScript representation. So now while you're calling the submit method, you're going to pass login as a parameter. So let's just say login here. And in my TS file, again, let's just say login. And along with it, I want login to be displayed. So I say login again. So now let's save this. And if you have a look at the browser, let's click on submit. And now here you can see the JavaScript representation. So within form, I can check for email or say first name. And here for this field first name, you can see different properties attached. You can see invalid. Is it invalid or is it untouched, which is true, or are there any errors? So this basically gives you all information about the particular field. So we can make use of this feature to validate the information. So we're going to learn about that in our next segment. Moving on to form validation, one way to ensure that incorrect fields are not submitted is by disabling the submit button. Correct? Now apart from this, you can also specify certain properties in your input tag for the corresponding input field. Now, let's say that the fields can't be empty and the form only accepts names with a minimum length of 2 and the maximum length of 7. Alright. So here in my input tag, I just mention required, meaning this field cannot be empty, and min length to 2 and max length to say 7. Alright. So to check this, let's go to our browser, and here let me submit the form without filling the first name, and evidently there has to be an error. So when I submit it and I look here within forms and here controls, and my first name, you can see that an error is shown. Here it says required equals true. That means there is one error. Now you can make use of these form control objects. You can leverage form control objects to ensure field validation and display a message whenever an error occurs. Right? So to do that, you need to access these objects like errors or invalid or touched. All of these properties or objects need to be accessed. For that, we'll have to create a template variable. And then this variable is assigned to this object. So back in our VS Code, let's create a variable. Let me call it name. And let's say ng model. Alright. Here the variable name receives the control object. So here back in my browser, when I submit again without the first name, you can see that the invalid property is set to true. Correct? So this helps us use this property to alert the user with the help of a simple if logic. So back in my VS Code, let me create another div tag within which I mention ngIf, within which I'm going to use a simple if logic. So let's say ngIf if name, which is our template variable, name dot touched and name dot invalid is true, right? Then I'm going to alert. So I'm going to make use of an alert here. Let's say alert danger. Alright. So in my CSS file, I'll have to mention the simple styling for alert. So here, let me just say, so we're going to have the background color red for danger, alright? And here I'm going to display the message invalid in bold. So now let's go back to our browser and check it. So let me proceed without entering the last name. It says invalid here. So this was a simple demonstration to show you form validation. Of course, you can modify the code depending on your requirement. Say suppose the length of the first name is too short, then you can alert the user with a different message. Or suppose they have missed out on filling a form field, then you can again alert the user. So you can basically make use of the nested if condition, right? Now just to help you understand that better, let me just show it to you. Now back in my HTML file, instead of invalid, let me have another tag, a paragraph tag, within which I make use of ngIf again. Now ngIf name.errors.required is true. Then I display the message first name required. Alright. And if the length of the first name is not 2, now if the length of the first name is less than 2, then I'm going to display another message. So let me just say name.errors.minLength. If this is true, then I'm going to say sorry, short first name. Alright, so let's save this and have a look at the browser. When I proceed without providing the name, it says first name required. But when I type in one character, it says sorry, short first name. But if I type in another character, it accepts. So I hope this made you understand how form validation works. So this was just a simple demonstration again. Now I highly recommend you explore these properties and play around with these objects. Trust me, it's really fun. So I hope this tutorial helped you out. I'm sure you all know that an Angular app is divided into several components. For example, you have the logo component, you have the sign-in component, an image component, and say a create account component. Now these components are standalone and each of them represents a part of the user interface. Now imagine if all of these components performed common tasks, for example, accessing the database or rendering images on the view, tasks like those. Now instead of having to write the code for every component, you can just make use of Angular services. Now the service can be written once and then injected into all of these components. Now a service could be a function, it could be a variable or a feature that an application needs. So the main use of a service is to write code once and avoid rewriting of it. Now the same code can be injected into several components that make use of this particular service. But what are Angular services? So normally components are used to ensure a good user experience. Now that is the extent of it. Components make sure that whatever is being rendered onto the screen is right and pristine. But in order to execute tasks, we make use of services, and this approach is ideal. So a component can basically delegate tasks like fetching data from the server, validating user input, or logging directly to the console to a particular service. And these tasks can be made available to any component in the app. So now let's talk about a few features of Angular services. Now typically an Angular service is simply a TypeScript class with an @injectable decorator. This decorator tells Angular that the class is a service and can be injected into components that need that service. Now they can be used to share the same piece of code. They can also inject other services as dependencies. Now these services hold valuable business logic and can also be used to interact with the backend. Now for example, if you want to make AJAX calls, you can have methods to those calls in a service and then use it as a dependency in files. And as mentioned earlier, it can be used to share data among several components. In Angular, services are singleton, meaning that only a single instance of a service gets created and the same instance is used by each and every building block in the application. And finally, a service can be registered as a part of a module or it can be registered as a part of the component. Now to register it as a part of the component, you'll have to specify it in the provider's array of the module. I'm sure you'll understand the concept of services better if we look at a simple demo. So in the next section, we're going to look at a demo, but before that, let me tell you the use case. So basically in the demo, what we'll do is we'll create an employee details list. Say for example, you will have employee information like name, employee ID and their email ID. We'll create a database of say 3 employees. And on the browser, when you click on the employee button, it displays the information about that particular employee. And at the end, we can also add information to the employee's details. So without delay, let's head to our VS Code and start learning Angular services hands-on. So here, first I've created a folder called demo_Angular, within which I've created a file called hello world. So this was previously used for a tutorial, so the name is just hello world, so don't get confused. However, when you look at the browser, I've written an initial code here, which is Angular services, and I have the Simplilearn logo. So back in my browser, this is what the UI looks like. So to understand the concept of Angular services, first let's go ahead and create a component. So here I'm going to say ng gc einfo. I'm creating a component for employee information. So as you can see, inside my app file, we have the einfo component, which has these 4 files. So if you're wondering what exactly components are and how this is working, then I highly suggest you watch our components video first. So now let's go ahead and create a service. So I'm just typing in the command ng g service. Here G stands for generate, and we're generating a service, and the name of the service that I'm providing is data. So now it creates a service which is going to be a .ts file. So you can observe that .service is appended. This indicates that it is a service. Alright. As mentioned earlier, we have to display the employee details. Correct? So for that, in my component.ts file, I'm going to create an array that displays the employee information. In our case, I'm creating 3 different employee records. So for that, I'll have 3 different arrays. So let me just call the arrays info received 1, indicating this is the information of first employee, and this is going to be of type string, and I'll just initialize it to null for now. Alright, and I'm going to create 2 other arrays, and let me just change the name of the arrays. Alright. So now to retrieve the information, I'll have to create a method. Again, I'm creating 3 methods for the 3 different employee records. So I'm going to call the array getInfo from service 1, indicating it's again for employee 1. And I'm just going to leave it as it is for now. I'll tell you how the information is being received. And I'm going to do the same for the other 2 employee records. So let me just copy paste, and here I'm just going to change the name of the methods. Alright. So this is the initial code for retrieving information. However, we'll have to create the employee record in our service. So back here in my data.ts file, what I'm going to do is I'll create 3 different records for the employees. So let me say info1, which is going to be of type string. Alright. And let me just give random names. Say for example, I say John Matthew. Alright. And employee ID, say E354. And let me just give a random email ID and say jm@abc.net. Alright, so I'm going to do the same for the other 2 records. So let me just create another one and call it info2. And the name I'm providing is, say, Rob Wilson, with a different employee ID, say 673. And I'm just going to make it rw@abc.net. And another record for employee number 3. And I'm just going to say Rose Adams with some employee ID and an email ID. Alright. So now we've created the employee records. So what I have to do is I have to create a method that returns these employee records. Correct? So for that, I'm just going to create another method called getInfo1, which is of type string, and it just returns this .info1. Alright. Similarly, for the rest of the 2 records, I'm just going to retrieve them. Let's say info2 and getInfo2. And again, I'm just going to make it getInfo3. And this is going to return info3. Alright. So I'm sure you've got an idea as to what I'm doing here. So basically, this information is going to be retrieved in our employee component, correct? So for that, I'll have to make use of dependency injection. So here, I'll have to import the service that I've created. So let's go ahead and say import. The service was data service, alright, from /data.service. Alright. Now, the main reason we're doing this is to tell Angular that when the component is created, the service instance is also created. And this instance is being used to perform particular tasks. And for that, we'll also have to include this in our providers array. So here, let me just say providers. And let's say data service. Now, to access this instance of service that is created, we make use of a property. So this property basically allows us to access all the methods that are defined in the service class. Alright, so here in my constructor method, I'm just going to say private, and you can give any name for your property, and here I'm just giving the name dService, alright, and which is of type data service. Alright. So now with the help of this property, I can retrieve information from the service class. So here I'm just going to say this dot info received equals this dot dService dot get info1. Alright. So what it basically does is that it calls the get info1 method in our service, which returns the information of the first employee. And this information is being stored in the array that is info received 1. So similarly for the next two methods, I'm just going to use the same piece of code. Let me just change it here. And same for the third one. Alright. So now that we have the logic behind what is being displayed, let's go ahead and create the UI for it. Here in my HTML file, I'm going to create an unordered list. And now I'm going to make use of the ng for directive to basically loop over the record and display everything. So for that I have to make use of a particular variable. So I'll just say let info of info received. So you can check here in our TS file, the array is info received, correct? So I'm going to make use of the same array here. And since it's displaying the first employee record, I'm just going to say info received 1. Alright, and let me just create a class, a Bootstrap class of list group item, of list group info. And we're just going to have to interpolate info. Alright, that is basically going to display what the information holds, what the info variable holds. Alright, and here as well, let me create a Bootstrap class called list group. Alright, I hope this was clear to you. So basically here, the information is being retrieved with the help of this method, right? That is get info from service 1. So in order to call this method, we'll have to bind it with a button. Alright, so that's what we're going to do. Let's just copy this, and here I'm going to create a button. Alright, and the type is button. With name button again. Alright, so I'm going to bind it with the click event. So what happens is that when I click on it, this particular method gets called. Alright, I'm just pasting the method here. And finally, let's just provide the name employee1 for the button. Alright. So similarly, we'll have to do the same for the other two records as well. Let me just make this look better. Alright. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to paste the same twice. And here I'm going to just change the names. I'll say 2 here. And this is again for employee 2. And I'm going to change this as well. It's going to be employee it's going to be info received 2. This is going to be info received 3. And finally, employee 3. All right. And lastly, we'll have to include the selector, that is app-e-info, in our main component.html. So here, let me just create a custom tag. All right, and save this. So now let's go back to our browser and see what it looks like. So here you can see that 3 different buttons have been created for employee 1, 2, and 3. And when you click on it, it retrieves the information, that is the name, the employee ID, and their email IDs. So we've successfully created an Angular service and injected it into our component to retrieve information. Alright, so now the last part of the use case that we discussed was to add another detail, that is the employee detail, in the record. Alright, so for that we'll have to take input from the user, and in our case we're taking the location. Now we're also adding the same location for all 3 employees. So this is what services do. They can be used to update, modify, alter anything that happens in the backend. So you can tweak the code a little bit and you can change the entire view of your application. You can add information, you can delete, you can retrieve, you can alter, etc. Alright, so for that, what we're going to do is, back in the HTML file, we'll create a form that basically takes the input. So I'm just going to say form, alright, within which I'm going to be defining a div class, within which I'm going to be defining a div tag, inside of which I'll have the input tag of type text, and the name I'm going to be providing it will be location. Alright, and we'll have a value, and I'll just leave it blank, and finally I'll have ng model. So if you're confused as to what I'm doing here, then I suggest you watch the Angular Forms video. It basically teaches you how to work around with Angular Forms. Alright, and now after this we're gonna have a button. So let me say button. Alright, and I'm going to just say add info. Okay. Alright, so now when I'm creating the form, I'll also have to create a template variable to access all the values within my form. So if I have to access the location, then I'll need a variable to access it. So here, let me just go ahead and create a template variable. Let me call it frm, and I'm going to make use of the ng form directive. So this tells Angular that this variable can be used to access all the values within the form. And since I'm using form here, I'll have to import it in my module file. So here I just go ahead and say import forms module from Angular Forms, and here in my imports I'll just say forms module. Okay, so I've imported the forms module. So now back in my HTML file, what I'm going to do is that I'll have to make use of this template variable to update my information, correct? So I'll have to create another method that will update information into the records. So here in my component.ts file, I'll have to create another method, and I'm going to call this method update info method. All right, and this basically takes in the template variable, that is form, and let me just specify any. Okay, and what this is going to do is that it updates the record, correct? So I'm going to say this dot dservice dot add info. Now you must be wondering what add info is. I'll just let you know in a minute. And the value that I'm going to be passing will be the value that you've provided as an input, which is nothing but form dot value dot location. All right, so now what happens is that I'll have to again specify what add info is, and this method is going to be defined in the service file, correct? So here I'm going to create another method, that's add info, and I'm going to pass info as a parameter. And what this method does is that it just pushes the information or the data into the arrays. So since I'm going to be pushing the same information into all of these arrays, that is info1, info2 and info3, I'm just going to say this dot info1 dot push of info. All right, and the same for the other two arrays as well. Let me just change these. All right, so what exactly I'm doing is that I have a method called add info, which gets information from the component. All right, and it basically pushes this information into the array. And also I'll have to return it, so I'll say return this dot info1. All right, and I'll save it. And here we have another method called update info, which basically calls the add info method in our service and passes the value to it. And in my HTML file, also note that the button type here is submit and not button. So what happens is that now the value that we've received as an input has to be passed on to the method, that is update info. So here I'll say ng submit, and I'm going to call the method update info, and I'm going to pass frm as the argument. And now let's save this and execute. So all right, here you can see that we have an input field and a button saying add info. So now I can just go ahead and say type USA, and when I say add info, and when I check on my employee 1 details, USA has been added to the list, and same goes with employee 2 and employee 3. So I hope this simple demo on Angular services helped you understand the concept better. I highly recommend you play around and explore other possibilities. Let's understand what exactly is Bootstrap. Bootstrap is a powerful toolkit, basically a collection of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript tools for creating and building responsive web applications and pages. It is a free and open source project based on GitHub and originally created by Twitter. Now, to put it more easily, Bootstrap is a giant collection of handy, reusable bits of code written in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. It's also a front-end development framework that enables developers and beginners to design quick and responsive websites. Now, there are several advantages to using Bootstrap. To name a few, Bootstrap comes with a responsive grid. You don't have to spend time working on your layouts. Bootstrap comes with its own code for automatically resizing images based on the current screen size. It also comes with different components that you can use for your web page. These components could be navigation bars, drop-downs, progress bars, thumbnails, etc. It also offers excellent documentation and is customizable. So Bootstrap comes in extremely handy to create responsive user interface. So now, before using Bootstrap, it needs to be embedded into your application. So let's see how to embed Bootstrap into Angular. Now there are two ways to do it. First up is by using the Bootstrap CDN or the Content Delivery Network. Now this enables users to load CSS, JavaScript and images remotely from its servers. The other method is to use Bootstrap NPM. Bootstrap, jQuery and other packages and frameworks can be installed via the command prompt. In the tutorial that I'm going to be showing you, I've embedded Bootstrap using NPM. Alright, so I'm sure you'll only understand the concept better when you look at a demo. So let's go ahead and create an application with the help of Angular Bootstrap. So in this tutorial, what I'm going to be showing is the creation of a blog post. So let me show you what we're going to be doing. So here I've created a simple blog for Simplilearn and I've added the Simplilearn logo. I've also written a few lines about Simplilearn and what they offer. I've also mentioned their tagline, and when you scroll down, you can see that I've mentioned the different courses they're offering. And when you click on the More Info button, it navigates to the official page that gives you the overview for that particular course. So this is for Lean Six Sigma, the same for full stack web development as well. And the same for the last one, that is cybersecurity. And finally, I've added a simple video here to just make it more beautiful. So I've added a simple video. And lastly, I've also linked our YouTube channel. So when you click on the YouTube icon, it will navigate to the YouTube channel, to our YouTube channel here. Alright, so this is what we're going to be creating using Angular Bootstrap. So I'm hoping you're all ready for it. So without further delay, let's jump in. So first, let's find the template that we want to use for our blog. So for that, I'm going to just go ahead and say Bootstrap blog template. And I'm just going to click on the first link that I get. And here you can choose the template that you like. So I'm just going to look for more templates here. And the one that we are going to choose is, this one. So which is small businesses. So you can go ahead and click on that. You can then click on live preview. And once you do that, you can just say view frame source. So here you can see that the HTML code is available. It has the head section and then the body section. So the head section consists of a lot of meta tags, and then you have the title, and then you also have the CSS file references. And then if you look at the body tag, you have different code for different parts of the UI. There's code for navigation bar, and then you have page content code, heading row, call to action, and all of that. And lastly, you have the footer. So what we're going to be doing is that we'll take all of the code, and then we'll have to create components for each of it, and then we'll include all the components in our main HTML file. So that is the best practice that Angular uses. So we're going to make use of components. And you can also see that when you scroll down, you can see that it has certain dependencies. So here it has the Bootstrap dependency, and then you have jQuery. So we'll have to download them. So we'll have to install them. And as mentioned earlier, we're going to be installing them with the help of NPM. So for that, we'll have to head back to our VS Code. Here, back in my VS Code, I've created a folder called Angular Demo, and then I've also created a file called Demo Components. And here I'm just going to say cd demo components, within which I'll say npm install jQuery. So this could take a while, and once you've installed jQuery, go ahead and type npm install Bootstrap. Alright, so we've successfully installed jQuery and Bootstrap. So now we need to add the references to these JavaScript files. To do that, go to your angular.json file, and here we'll have to add them in our build section. So here you can see we have styles and scripts. So in our scripts array, we define the relative path to these JavaScript files. So these files are generally stored in your node modules. So go ahead and here you can look for Bootstrap. Here you go, and then in your dist file, and then click on JS, and then you can see you have bootstrap.min.js. Oh, well, I'm sorry, we need bootstrap.bundle.min.js. So here you can just right click and say copy relative path, and back in my JSON file in my scripts, I'm gonna just paste it here, and make sure to make it a path by providing /. Alright, and then the next thing we need is the jQuery.min.js file. So for that, again, in our node modules, you'll have to look for jQuery. So here there's jQuery, and then click on dist, and then we have jQuery.min.js. So again, let me just copy the path and paste it here. Follow the same procedure for this as well. Alright, so we've embedded both our files in our angular.json file. So now in our code here, in the beginning, they've also included the CSS file. So we'll have to embed that as well. So here back in Bootstrap, let me just add the CSS file as well. That's bootstrap.min.css. I'm just going to copy the relative path and just provide it here. Let me just change these to /. Okay, so we have our custom style sheet. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy this and just paste it in our, and then you can just paste it here. All right. So I think we've added all the dependencies and the custom style sheet and everything. So now let me just close all of these files. What we can do now is that we can go ahead and take the code from the source here. So I'm just going to copy the body tag. All right. So I'm going to copy this till the footer, and then I'm just going to paste it in my component.html file. So as mentioned earlier, I will create components and then place the code for specific parts of the UI in these components. So let me just see if I've got everything here. Okay. So I'll be creating 4 components. The first one will be for the navigation bar. The second will be for the introduction. And then the third one will be to display the courses that we're providing. And then lastly, we'll have the footer component. right? So first let's create these components. I've also created a components folder here in my app folder. So I just have to type in the command nggc. First we'll create the component for the top navigation bar. So I'm just saying nggc. So I'm just going to say components / navbar. Alright, so the component has been created. So what I'm going to do is I'll just copy this and paste it here. Alright, and the next component I'm going to be creating is for the introduction, right? So I'll say nggc components / intro. Alright, so I will have to take this code here. I'm also going to be including the call to action part. So I'll just copy paste this one in my intro.html file. So let me do that. And then I'm going to have the main course content component. So for that I'll say nggc components / courses, and we're gonna copy the next part of the code, all right, until till the footer. Let me just add it here. And finally we're going to create the component for the footer. So I'll say nggc components / footer. And the last part of the code, I'm just going to add it there. All right. So now we'll have to create the custom HTML tags for these components and then place it in our HTML file, right? So first one that we created was the navigation bar. So here, head over to the TS file, just copy the selector, and then here, and then in our app.component, let me just create the tags. Similarly for intro, just going to copy the selector, and then for courses, so we have app-courses, that as well. And then lastly, we have the footer component. So let me just copy that. Paste it here. Alright, so we've included all the components. So let's just run this application and see if everything is displayed intact. So here, let me just say ng serve. So when you execute the command, you can see that the template is being displayed. So you have the navigation bar, you have the intro component, and then we have the courses component, and finally we have the footer component, right? Okay, so now that we have the template ready, we can go ahead and customize it according to our needs. So now I'm going to be making a few changes to the code. We're going to add the Simplilearn logo. We're going to change the tagline here. We're going to display something else over here. Alright, so let's go back to our VS Code to customize and display the final output. So here, the first thing that I'm going to be doing is changing the message here. I'm going to display Simplilearn. For that, in our navbar component, Let's go to the HTML code. And here, instead of start Bootstrap, let me just type in Simplilearn. Alright, so when you save it and when you look at the browser, you can see that Simplilearn is displayed. And the next thing that I want to do is I want to add the image, right? A Simplilearn logo. So what I've done here is I've already added the logo .png file in my assets folder. So I'll just go ahead and provide the path to this. So that's going to be in our intro file. So here, image source is going to be assets / logo.png. So let me save this. So there we go, the logo is displayed. So the next thing is we'll have to change this part of the UI. So the information that I want to display is this. I'm going to be displaying world's #1 online bootcamp and other information. So what I'm going to do is back in my VS Code, I'm just going to delete this, and instead of that I'm just going to copy this. That's world's #1 online bootcamp, and then within the paragraph tag I'll display something else. So let me get rid of this. Let me just copy the information that I want to display, paste it here, and let me just give a line break. Let me save this and see if it's displayed. So yeah, we can see that the information is being displayed. Next up here, instead of displaying call to action message, I'm going to display a explore programs message. So let's go back to our VS Code. Let me just say explore programs here. And then lastly, instead of this message here, I want to display the message get certified, get ahead with our programs. So back in our VS Code, I'm just going to get rid of this. And paste this instead. So when you have a look at the browser, let me refresh this. You can see it displays the message get certified, get ahead, and all of that. Well, now what I'm going to do is I'm really not happy with the font size and everything. So I'm just go ahead and add certain styling. You can customize this and provide your own font size and all of that. So here I'm just going to mention style and then say font size, and I'm going to make it XX large. All right, so let's see. Yeah, all right, so it's the font size has increased, so I think I'm happy with this. All right, so the next thing we have to do is add information here for our courses. So back in our VS Code, we'll have to go to the courses component. So here I'm going to just type in the code for the different courses. So I already have it here. So the first thing is this message that I want to display. Let me just copy that. And for our first tag, I'm just going to say postgraduate program ND in Six Sigma. And the next information I'm going to be providing is the duration. So here, let me just get rid of this. Paste that here. Let me just break the line to beautify the code. And then And here for our reference link, I already have the link here. So I'm just going to paste that. So once you click on the more info button, it will automatically navigate to this page. Alright, so let me save this. Next up, I'm going to do the same for the other two courses as well. So it says postgraduate program in full stack development. And then we're going to mention the duration and the cohort. So let me paste that. I'll also provide a line break. And then link, I have it here. So I'm just going to paste that. And finally, for the third card, I have the third link here. Let me get rid of this extra code and paste this instead. And then let's also provide the link for the same. Alright, so let me save this and have a look at the browser. So you can see that the information has been added. You can see it displays postgraduate program in Lean Six Sigma, full stack development and cybersecurity. So once I click on more info, it leads you to that page that shows the overview. Alright. So now the next thing on the agenda was to display a short video and then the link to our YouTube channel. So let's go ahead and add that in our courses component. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to get the code to add a video from Google, and then I'm going to provide the source, which is going to be the video that I would want to display. So I've received the code. I'm just going to paste it here. So you can get the code on Google. So go ahead and just paste that. Also for the source, I have a video in my assets folder, which I have provided here. So when I save it and look at the browser, here we go. You can see the video here. Alright. And once clicked, it starts playing. Alright. And lastly, we'll have to provide the logo for YouTube and then the link to navigate to the YouTube page. So let's go ahead and do that. So here again, I've pasted the code for the YouTube logo. So here you can see that I've added the image that is youtube.png in my assets folder, and I've provided the source. And accordingly, I've also added the styling. I've provided a white background and I've also aligned the text to the center of the page. Alright, and I've also displayed the message saying check out our YouTube channel for technical videos and tutorials. And then I've provided the link to our channel on YouTube. So let me just save this and head back to the browser. And here you can see that we have the YouTube logo and we have the message displayed. So once you click on the logo, it navigates to the Simplilearn channel on YouTube. Alright, so if you want, you can also change the message here for the footer. So here in footer.html, I can just remove this and paste this. I say Simplilearn Solutions and all rights reserved. When I save it and look at the browser, it must get updated. So yeah, there we go. So with the help of Bootstrap, we have successfully created a website which is basically a blog. And we've also added the reference links and images and logos to customize it according to our requirements. So yeah, this is it. This is how you make use of Bootstrap and embed it into your Angular for more responsive and better user interface. Let's have a look at the basics of routing. Now I'm sure that you've observed that the URL changes every time you click on a particular link or on an icon on the user interface. Correct? Now this basically indicates that you are navigating throughout the application. Now to achieve this navigation, we use a mechanism called routing. Routing is essentially used to navigate through a website or a web application. But how is it achieved in Angular? Especially in Angular, routing plays a major role. It is used to create single-page applications. Now these applications are loaded just once and new content is added dynamically. Applications like Google, Facebook, Twitter, and Gmail are a few examples of single-page applications. The best part of using single-page applications is that it provides an excellent user experience and you don't even have to wait for new pages to load, which by extension makes single-page applications extremely fast. But how is this new content loaded? Enter routing. Now routing is the mechanism that, as discussed earlier, that is used to navigate through the application and load new content. Routing helps Angular configure the route and the component that needs to be displayed. Now I'm sure you're going to understand the concept of routing better when you work on it hands-on. So in the demo, we're going to be navigating to the login and the home pages of a web application with the help of routing. So let's head to our Visual Studio Code. So basically, the objective of our application is to navigate to home and the login pages. So when I click on the login icon here, it loads the login page. And here you can see the extension /login. And similarly with home, once you click on it, some new information gets added and the URL changes with a /home appended. Alright, so this is the main objective of our application. So to create it, let's head back to our VS Code. Alright, so here I've created a folder called demo_angular and I've created a file called demo routing. Now the first thing you want to do is open the index.html file and make sure that the base tag is added. Now although this is generally added when your app is created, if it is not, then add a base tag with href attribute which is set to a /. Alright, now this is generally done to tell Angular to construct the URL while navigating with a /. Alright, and the next thing you want to do is open your app.module.ts file and check if the app routing module has been imported. If not, go ahead and import it and then also mention it in your imports array. With that, the initial setup is done. Now to create the nav bar, the code that I'm going to be using is already explained in the previous video, that is Angular Bootstrap. I highly suggest you go through that video before watching this. So the code is already available. I'm just going to create a component and write the code for it and paste the code in it. So let's do that. Let me say nggc navbar. Alright, so this component is now created. Now here in my HTML file, I'll just get rid of this and paste the code for the navbar. So here we go. I've pasted the code for the navigation bar. And back in my app.component.html file, I'll just remove all the unwanted code here and just specify the custom HTML tag for my navbar. So let me just create one here. Alright, let me save this. Let me just run the application and see if it's displaying correctly. Alright, so when I open the browser, the navigation bar has been created along with these different options, that's home, about, services, and login. Alright, and we also have the Simplilearn icon here. Alright, now the next step is to generate the components to display the login page content and the home page content. Now again, I have used Bootstrap to define the user interface for these files. You can easily find the code online. Just search for Bootstrap login templates, and depending on your requirements, you can choose the appropriate one. So first, let's create the components for my two files, that is for the home component and the login component. So let's go ahead and do that. Nggc, I'm just going to call it login for my login component. Alright, and then I'm going to say nggc home for the home component. Alright, so I'm just going to copy the code for the login component. So back in my login.html file, I'll just paste the code here. Okay. Also note that I've added the Simplilearn logo in my assets folder and then just provided the source for it here in my login component. Alright. So next up is the home component. And if you've seen the previous video, that is Angular Bootstrap, you might have seen that we created three different components, that is intro, courses and footer, which included the content for the intro message, for the courses and the footer message, correct? So here we're going to just paste the code for all of these three and then just display it when the home button is clicked. Alright, so what I'm going to do is I'll just paste it here. So this basically has all the content. One thing I want to tell you is that in the previous video, we made sure that the code was written in three different components. However, for this, I've just added all the code in the same component. Now, I agree that this is not the best practice. So if you want, you can go ahead and create three different components and separate the code into these three components and just add the custom HTML tags in your home component. I'm just hoping you're following me right now. And also here in my assets folder, I've added a video and the YouTube logo that needs to be displayed when the home icon is clicked. Alright, so now that we've created the home and the login components, the next step is to configure the routes for the application. Alright, so here you can see that we have a file called app-routing-module.ts file. So here we have the routes and the router module that is imported. And we also have a constant called routes, which is strongly typed to routes from the router package. Alright. Now this array is used to define all the possible routes in the application. Now each route is basically an object with a path. So here in my routes array, I'm just going to go ahead and create the paths. That is, we have two different routes, right? One is for login and one is for home. So I'm just going to create a path object. So let's say path. Within curly braces, I say path. And then the path that I'm going to give is login. This is basically what will appear on the URL. Alright. And the component that needs to be navigated to is nothing but the login component. So let me just say login component. As you can see, the login component has been automatically imported. Now same with the home path. So let me just say path home, and the component that needs to be rendered is the home component. Alright. Now the next step is to link these routes to a button in the nav bar, that is the home and the login button, right? So we're going to make use of the nav tag and an anchor tag for this. You can see that we have a nav tag and an anchor tag which encloses the login and the home components. Alright. Now we're going to make use of two directives from the router package called router link and router link active. Now these are specified within the anchor tag. The router link basically holds the path to the page, and the latter, that is the router link active, specifies one or more CSS classes that will be applied when the router link is active. Alright, so to do that, let me just add router link. Alright, in our case it is home here, and we're going to have another directive called router link active, and we're just going to say active here. Alright, same for the login icon here. Let me just copy this, and instead of home, the path we created for this was login. Alright, so this is how you can bind the route to your specific button on your UI. Now, despite of all this, how are we specifying where these components are to be displayed? Right? The answer to this is using the router outlet directive. Now again, this directive is available in the router package. So we have to add that in our app component.html file. So here, just go ahead and type router outlet. Alright, so with that, we've created a simple navigation bar which has different options, that is home, about, services and link. And once the user clicks on the home icon, it displays the content that is in the home component.html file. And once the user clicks on the login component, it displays the content in the login.html file. Alright, it's as simple as that. So now let's go to the browser and see if it executes correctly. So alright, we have the navigation bar, and once I click on the home icon here, alright, yes, we see that all the content has been loaded. You can see we have the intro section, we have the courses section and the footer section as discussed. And the most important part is that here in our URL, you can see that /home has been appended. This shows that a route has been created that navigates to the home component. So we've successfully created a route here. And for login component, when I click on this icon, you can see that the path changes here and the login component gets displayed. Alright, so this is how routing is achieved in Angular.
Choose from over 300 in-demand skills and get access to 1,000 plus hours of video content for free. Visit SkillUp by Simplilearn. Click on the link in the description to know more.
In this session, we'll be comparing the three cutting-edge UI development technologies, that is React.js, Angular, and Vue. We'll learn about the key differences that make them so distinct. All of these technology stacks have been replacing pure server-side technologies, and we've slowly progressed from server-side applications to more distributed applications where a part of the job is done on the client side and a part on the server side. And now we've transitioned to something known as single-page applications, or SPA. And all of these technologies that you see on your screen right now are based purely on JavaScript. As a result, they're lightweight and aren't dependent on any third-party runtime tools. So let's compare the three technologies and learn about the factors that make them stand out. So let's see what's in it for you. We learn about their features, use cases and where they're applied, their performance, how they handle data, the languages they use, and their testing mechanisms. We learn about the dedicated user community that backs these technologies, and finally we'll see the growth curve. First, we'll look into the salient features. Now, React is a front-end JavaScript library, while Angular and Vue are JavaScript frameworks. Now, although the terms library and frameworks are used interchangeably, they're significantly different. Now, library is a set of classes or functions, and the user is in complete control to call them. Frameworks, on the other hand, are like models. They have limited choices and come with a blueprint of their own. and as a result, the user doesn't have much control. So JavaScript, being an interpreted language where code is executed line by line, makes all these tools very efficient, mainly because converting the code into an intermediate code would require a runtime environment and would definitely encounter a delay. Now these are avoided, and as a result these tools are fast. Moving on, React is used to develop mobile and web applications, and Angular is used for single page applications, and you can also develop hybrid applications using this stack, mainly because it's purely based on CSS, HTML, JavaScript and jQuery. Single page applications, as the name suggests, are built using single page. Now the entire page is broken down into several components, wherein each component performs a specific task. Say for example, one component handles the login, the other one would display icons and images, and so on. All these bits or components are then put together to form a single page application. And moving on, React was developed and maintained by Facebook, while Angular was built by Google and Vue was developed by Evan You, an ex-Google employee. Now React represents the Vue part of the MVC framework, and Angular is a full-fledged MVC framework in itself, and Vue on the other hand is focused on Vue and the model layer of the MVC framework. Now what exactly is the MVC framework? Now MVC framework is an object-oriented design principle that mandates the separation of control, meaning one thing can only do one thing. So the model deals with the entity classes, the data and the business logic, while Vue deals with the representation and the UI logic of the application, and the controller drives the functionality of the two. Any changes can be easily factored and isolated, and as a result, testing becomes a whole lot easier. Moving on, now let's look at the use cases from the business perspective. In terms of React, we have top websites like Facebook, Instagram, Netflix that use React. On the other hand, we have Angular that is used by Nike, HBO, Forbes, Sony. And Vue is commonly used by Alibaba.com, Grammarly, 9gag and Adobe. Moving on, we have performance. Now performance is a very crucial feature. Now the moment you build an HTML view and render it into the browser, this view to the user is basically just HTML tags. However, if you look at the internal working, the code is actually converted into a balanced tree structure. This B-tree algorithm is extremely fast. So when the user makes any changes to the UI, the changes are reflected immediately. This is facilitated by the B-tree algorithm. So as a result, the performance is improved. So how does React make use of this tool? It uses a virtual DOM. DOM is an API developed by W3C. It stands for Document Object Model and defines how the document is accessed and manipulated. This DOM parser converts the HTML code into an inverse balanced tree structure. So React uses the virtual DOM, while Angular uses the real DOM and Vue uses the virtual DOM again. Now the virtual DOM looks at the differences between the current and the previous HTML pages and only changes the parts that need to be updated. Angular, on the other hand, updates the entire tree structure regardless of any changes made or not. And Vue again only updates the ones that have changed. Since there is no time spent on making unnecessary changes to the entire tree, React is extremely fast. On the other hand, real DOM updation is time-consuming, risky and error-prone. Vue also ensures faster and bug-free performance. Now let's talk about data binding, the core reason why we would use single-page applications. Now consider a scenario where you'd log into an e-commerce website as say user 1. Then you should be able to see the items in your shopping cart, while user 2 would be seeing different items in their shopping carts and so on. So identifying the user and retrieving data corresponding to that specific user is facilitated using the help of data binding. Data binding is a process that allows an internet user to manipulate web page elements using a web browser. Now it is used in interactive components such as calculators, tutorials, games, etc. Now React supports one-way data binding, meaning you can take the data from the view and push it to the model or vice versa. Angular, on the other hand, uses a two-way data binding, while Vue also uses a similar two-way data binding. In React, every time the model state updates, the view changes accordingly. However, the reverse is not true. In case of Angular, any changes made to the view are immediately reflected in the model part of the architecture. Vue follows the same principle. Now this hugely influences the performance. Due to one-way data binding, React is modular and fast, improving the performance. Angular's two-way data binding adversely affects the performance. And Vue, on the other hand, performs according to the input type. Moving on to scripting languages, React combines UI templates and JavaScript logic, resulting in a new language called JSX. So React only requires the knowledge of JavaScript. Angular uses templates, again in HTML. You can also inject JavaScript code into HTML using a clever implementation in Angular called directives. So you can create a class and then inject it into HTML. Angular also does something better. You can also write code for an Angular application using a newer language developed by Microsoft called TypeScript. It is a compiled language and is very similar to Java and C# in terms of syntax. Now Vue again uses HTML-based template. It uses HTML5 throughout for the UI and a combination of JavaScript for business logic. All Vue templates are valid HTML and can be parsed by HTML parsers. Let's move on to testing. Now Jest is a framework or an API that is developed by Facebook and is used to run tests on React applications to ensure that they are bug-free. Now it is embedded typically in every React library and requires zero configuration. Now Angular on the other hand uses the Jasmine framework. Now this framework allows various functionalities to write different kinds of test cases. This also ensures that the application is error-free. The Vue CLI or the command line interpreter has built-in options for unit testing with the help of Jest or Mocha. Now Vue typically has single file components and hence these components can be tested in isolation. This makes it modular and extremely fast. Now let's talk about community support. Since all these tools are open source, they have a large developer community. There are a few popular GitHub repositories for React such as React.js 101, reactjs.org and so on. You can raise queries, solve a few and connect with the larger community that's working on React. Here are a few repositories for Angular. Vue also has a few popular repositories. You can commit, download third-party plugins and also explore these stacks even deeper. All of them surely have a very happening community. At the time of writing, there were about 1 million repositories, 5 million commits and 1 million issues with respect to React. Here are the figures for Angular and here are the figures for Vue. According to NPM Stat, over the past 2 years, there have been approximately 360 million React.js downloads. There have been around 38 million downloads for Angular and around 63 million downloads for Vue. Now let's look at the future scope. Learning a new technology always comes with questions like what's in it for me, what's its growth potential, how far will it take me in my career, and so on. So let's go ahead and see the growth rate of React, Angular and Vue. According to Google Trends, over the past 12 months, React has been on a way faster upward trajectory than Angular and Vue, which have considerably lost their momentum. Now this indicates that React is growing faster than the other two with respect to popularity, industry adoption and community support. In this video, I present to you some commonly asked Angular interview questions. Now let's begin. I've classified the questions into two sections. One is the beginner level questions and one is the advanced level questions. So now let's begin with beginner level questions. Starting with the most basic, what exactly is Angular? Now Angular is an open source JavaScript front-end framework which is completely written in TypeScript. This framework brings structure and consistency to web applications and provides excellent scalability and maintainability. Now it's primarily aimed to develop single-page applications and is maintained by Google. It uses HTML's syntax to express your application's components clearly. It is designed for web, desktop, and mobile platforms. Next up is what exactly is TypeScript. Now TypeScript is a superset of JavaScript that offers excellent consistency. It is highly recommended as it provides some syntactic sugar and makes the code base more comfortable to understand and maintain. Ultimately, TypeScript code compiles down to JavaScript that can run efficiently in any environment. Now, typically, TypeScript is installed as an npm package and thus can be installed with the following command, that is npm install -g TypeScript. Moving on to our third question. What exactly is data binding and which type of data binding does Angular deploy? Now, data binding is a phenomenon that allows any internet user to manipulate web page elements. Now, it generally uses dynamic HTML and does not require any complex scripting or programming. We use data binding in pages that contain interactive components such as forms, calculators, tutorials, and games. Data binding makes incremental display of a web page more convenient. When it comes to Angular, it uses the two-way data binding. Any changes made to the user interface are reflected in the corresponding model state. Conversely, any changes in the model state are reflected in the UI state. This allows the framework to connect the DOM to the model data via the controller. Next question, what are single-page applications? Now, single-page applications are web applications that load just once, with new features just being mere additions to the user interface. It does not load new HTML pages to display the content. Instead, it's generated dynamically. This is made possible through JavaScript's ability to manipulate the DOM elements on the existing page itself. An SPA approach is faster, thus providing a seamless user experience. Differentiate between Angular and AngularJS. Now here's a simple table for you. So here are the features that we're going to differentiate the two on the basis of. First is language. AngularJS uses JavaScript while Angular uses TypeScript. When it comes to architecture, AngularJS supports the model view controller design while Angular uses components and directives. AngularJS is not supported by mobile browsers while Angular supports all mobile browsers. AngularJS does not support dependency injection while Angular does. When it comes to routing, @route provider is used to provide routing information in the case of AngularJS, and in case of Angular, @route configuration is used to define routing information. When it comes to management, AngularJS is difficult to manage with an increase in source code size, while Angular is better structured, easy to create, and can manage bigger applications. Next up, what are decorators in Angular? Decorators are a design pattern or functions that define how Angular features work. Now they are used to make prior modifications to a class, service, or filter. Angular supports 4 types of decorators, namely class decorators, property decorators, method decorators, and parameter decorators. Next question. Mention some advantages of Angular. First up is custom components. Now, Angular enables users to build their own components that can pack functionality along with rendering logic into reusable pieces. This is achieved with the help of these components. Data binding. As discussed earlier, Angular enables users to effortlessly move data from JavaScript code to the view and react to users' events without having to write any code manually. Angular supports dependency injection, which enables users to write modular services and inject them wherever they need it. When it comes to testing, tests are first-class tools, and Angular has been built from ground up with testability in mind. You will have the ability to test every part of your application, and that is highly recommended. Next up is comprehensive. Angular is a full-fledged framework and provides out-of-the-box solutions for server communication, routing with your application, and more. Lastly, Angular is cross-platform and compatible with multiple browsers. An Angular application can typically run on all browsers, be it Chrome, Firefox, Safari, and operating systems like Windows, macOS, and Linux. What's new with Angular 10? First up is that older versions of TypeScript are not supported. Previous versions of Angular supported TypeScript 3.6, 3.7, and even 3.8. But with Angular 10, TypeScript bumped to TypeScript 3.9. Warnings about common JS imports. Now, logging of unknown property bindings or element names in templates is increased to the error level, which was previously a warning. Angular now supports an optional strict setting, which offers a stricter project setup when you create a new workspace. There's an addition of ngCC features with a program-based entry point finder. There are common compiler updates and updated URL routing. Angular 10 has several deprecated APIs that were previously redundant. With Angular 10 version, there have been a number of bug fixes, important ones being the compiler avoiding undefined expressions and the core avoiding a migration error. New default browser configuration. Browser configuration for new projects has been upgraded to outdo older and less used browsers. Next up is core. All the warnings will be now logged in as errors. Next update is converting pre-IV code. Now all the pre-IV dependencies from NPM should be transformed to IV dependencies, which is supposed to take place as a precursor to running ngtsc at the application. And lastly, we have service workers. For the service worker, a fix has been put in for a situation in which there was a chance that the service worker would not register when there is a long-running task or a recurring timeout. Next up is what are templates in Angular. Now, Angular templates are written with HTML that contains Angular specific elements and attributes. Now, in combination with model and controllers information, these templates can be rendered to provide a dynamic view to the user. Now, templates are a very predominant feature of Angular that describe how information can be displayed in the view. Next question is what are annotations in Angular? Now, these annotations are used to create an annotation array. They are basically the metadata set on the class that is used to reflect the metadata library. What are directives in Angular? Directives are attributes that allow the user to write new HTML syntax specific to their applications. Now, these execute whenever the Angular compiler finds them in the DOM. Now, again, Angular supports 3 different types of directives. There are component directives, attribute directives, and structural directives. Next up, what is AOT compilation and what are some of its advantages? Now, AOT, that stands for Ahead of Time Compiler, basically converts the Angular HTML and TypeScript into JavaScript code during the build phase. That is before the browser downloads and runs the code. So basically all the HTML and TypeScript code is converted to JavaScript during the build phase, which means no additional time is spent on converting it into JavaScript later during the run phase, right? So when it comes to advantages, of course, there's faster rendering. There are fewer asynchronous requests. It has smaller Angular framework download size. There's quick detection of errors. And this also offers better security. Moving on to the next question, what are components? Now, components are the most basic building blocks of the UI in an Angular application. Now, every component is associated with a template and is a subset of directives. Only one component can be instantiated per element in a template. Now, an Angular application typically consists of a root component, which is basically the app component, and then it branches out into other components, creating a hierarchy. Now, every component is decorated with the help of @component_decorator, which provides additional information. And component must belong to the ng module. Lastly, components implement something called the lifecycle hooks. You will learn about them a little later in the video. Next up, what are pipes in Angular? Now, pipes are simple functions that are designed to accept a particular input value, process this value, and return an output which is a transformed value. Now, Angular supports several built-in pipes. However, you can also create custom pipes that cater to your needs. But to speak about a few salient features, pipes are defined using the pipe symbol. Pipes can be chained with other pipes, and pipes can be provided with arguments by using the colon sign. Next up, what are pure pipes? Now, these pipes are pipes that use pure functions. As a result of this, a pure pipe doesn't use any internal state, and the output remains the same as long as the parameters passed stay the same. Angular calls a pure pipe only when it detects a change in the parameters being passed. Now, a single instance of a pure pipe is used throughout all components. Next up, what are impure pipes? Now, for every change detection cycle in Angular, these impure pipes are called regardless of the change in the input fields. As long as there's a change detected, these pipes are called. As a result, multiple pipe instances are created for these pipes. Now, inputs passed to these pipes can also be mutable. By default, all pipes are pure. However, you can also mention impure pipes using the pure property. Now, here's a code for specifying impure pipes. You can use the pure property and either mention true or false True meaning it's a pure pipe, and false indicates that it's an impure pipe. Next up, what is the pipe transform interface? Now, as the name suggests, the interface receives an input value and transforms it into the desired format with a transform method. It is typically used to implement custom pipes. Now, here's again a small piece of code. Now, you can see that the pipe transform interface is being used, which in turn executes the transform method. Now, this transform method is the one that is responsible to change your input and give a transformed output. Moving on, what is ng module? Now, ng modules are basically containers that reserve a block of code to an application domain or a workflow. Now, the @ng module takes a metadata object that describes how to compile a components template and generate an injector at runtime. In addition to this, ng module also identifies the module's components, directives, services, pipes, and it also ensures that it makes them public so that external components can use them. All of this is taken care of by the ng module. Next up, what are filters in Angular? Now, filters are used to format an expression and present it to the user. They can be used in view templates, controllers, or services. Now, to name a few, there's date filter, which formats a date to a specified format. There's filter that selects a subset of items from an array. There's the JSON filter, which formats an object to a JSON string. There's limit to, which limits an array or a string into a specified number of elements or characters. Then there's lowercase, which formats a string to lowercase, and so on. Moving on to the next question, what is view encapsulation in Angular? Now, view encapsulation basically defines whether the template and styles defined within the component can affect the application or vice versa. Angular provides 3 encapsulation strategies. There's emulated encapsulation, which means that the styles from the main HTML propagate to the component. Then there is native, which indicates that the styles from the main HTML do not propagate to the component, meaning it does not affect the component. And lastly, there's none, which means that styles from the component propagate back to the main HTML and therefore are visible to all the components on the page. Now, this indicates any different types of changes and how it is affecting the entire application. Moving on, what are controllers? Now, as the name suggests, controllers control the data of Angular applications. They are regular JavaScript objects, and the ng controller directive defines the application controller. Next question, what do you understand by scope in Angular? Now, the scope in Angular binds the HTML, that is basically the view, and the JavaScript, that is the controller. It is also an object with the available properties and methods required for your application. Now, when you make a controller in Angular, you pass the $scope object as an argument. Moving on to the most commonly asked question, explain the lifecycle hooks in Angular. As discussed earlier, every component in Angular has a lifecycle. Angular creates and renders these components and also destroys them before removing them from the document object model. It is achieved with the help of these lifecycle hooks. Now let's have a look at them. First up is ng on changes. Now this responds when Angular sets or resets data-bound input properties. Ng on it is a hook that initializes the directive or a component after Angular first displays the data-bound properties and sets the component's input properties. Ng do check detects and acts upon the changes that Angular can't or won't detect on its own. Ng after content init responds after ng projects external content into the component's view. Ng after content checked responds after Angular checks the content projected into the component. Ng after view init responds after Angular initializes the component's views and child views. ng after view checked responds after Angular checks the component's views and the child views. Lastly, there's ng on destroy, which cleans up just before Angular destroys the directive or the component. Moving on to the next question, what is string interpolation in Angular? Now, string interpolation is a one-way data binding technique that is used by Angular. Now, it outputs the data from TypeScript code to HTML view. It is typically denoted with the help of curly braces, and it helps display data from the component to the view. To help you understand its working, I've created a variable called name here in my app.component.ts file and initialized it to Simplilearn. And back in my HTML file, I've created a header tag which displays the name of the company is, and I've interpolated here with the help of double curly braces. So when I run the file, the output looks something like this. The name of the company is Simplilearn. So this is how string interpolation is achieved in Angular. Moving on to next question. What are template statements? Template statements are properties or methods used in HTML for responding to user events. Now with these template statements, the application that you create or you're working on can have the capability to engage users through actions such as submitting forms or displaying dynamic content. The most common example is the button tag. The template here is delete hero. This method is called when the user clicks on the button. So this brings interactivity to your application. With that, we come to the end of the first section, which included the beginner level questions. Moving on, let's look at some advanced level questions. What is the difference between ahead of time and just-in-time compilation? Now, ahead of time compilation converts your code during the build time before the browser downloads and runs the code. In case of just-in-time compilation, this process is a way of compiling computer code to machine code during the execution phase. AOT ensures faster rendering to the browser, while just-in-time is basically a dynamic compilation. In case of ahead of time compiling, the user should include the --AOT option with the ng build or ng serve command. NGIT compilation is the default compilation when you run the ng build or ng serve CLI commands. Next up, explain the @component decorator. Now here's a simple screenshot of what the @component decorator encompasses. It is basically a TypeScript class that is used to create components. This genre of class is then decorated with the @component decorator. The decorator's purpose is to accept a metadata object that provides relevant information about the component. Now the image above shows an app component, which is a pure TypeScript class decorated with the @component decorator. The object that gets accepted by the decorator provides properties like template URL, selectors, style URLs, and many more. Now here the template URL property points to an HTML file defining what you see on the application. Moving ahead, what are services in Angular? Angular services perform tasks that are used by multiple components. Now these tasks could be data fetching, network connections, or database management, among others. They perform all the operational tasks for the components and avoid rewriting of code. A service can be written once and then injected into all the components that use it. Generally, components are used to only display information on the UI. They do not perform any other backend tasks. To perform tasks like validating information or network connections, etc., you can make use of a service. One advantage is that this service can be injected into multiple components that make use of the same piece of code. With this, you can avoid redundancy. Moving on, what are promises and observables? Now, while both the components deal with asynchronous events in Angular, promises handle one such event at a time, while observables handle a sequence of events over some time. So to give you a brief explanation, promises emit a single value at a time, while observables are only executed when subscribed to them using the subscribe method. Now, promises also execute immediately after they are created and they're not cancelable, while observables help perform operations like for each, filter, retry, etc. Promises push errors to the child promises, and observables can be unsubscribed to so that the listener stops receiving further values. Next up, what is ng on init and how is it defined? Now again, here's a small snippet of code. ng on init is a lifecycle hook, as we discussed earlier, and it is a callback method that is run by Angular to indicate that a component has been created. It takes no parameters and returns a void type. So I'm sure you can see here in the code, it takes no parameters and returns a void. Next up, explain the use of ng for in a tag, or explain the ng for directive. Now, the ng for directive is basically like a for loop. It is used to build lists and tables in HTML templates. So in simple terms, this directive is used to iterate over an array or an object and create template for each such element. Now, in the snippet, you can see there is let items in item list, and then I've string interpolated the variable item. So let item here creates a local variable that will be available inside the template. Of items indicates that we are iterating over the items iterable, and the asterisk before ng for creates a parent template. Next up, what are template and reactive forms? So there are two different methods to create forms. We have the template driven approach and we have the reactive form approach. So let's have a look at them. In case of template driven approach, the conventional form tag is used to create forms. Angular automatically interprets and creates a form object representation for this tag. Controls can be added to the form using the ng model tag. Multiple controls can be grouped using the ng control group module. Now, a form value can be generated using the form.value object, and form data is exported as JSON values. Basic HTML validations can be used to validate the form fields. In the case of custom validations, directives can be used. When it comes to reactive forms, this approach basically revolves around data flows and propagation of change. Now, with reactive forms, the component directly manages the data flows between the form controls and the data models. Reactive forms are code-driven, unlike template-driven approach. Reactive forms break the traditional declarative approach and eliminate the anti-pattern of updating data via the two-way data binding method. Typically, reactive form control creation is synchronous and can be unit tested with synchronous programming techniques. Moving on, what is Bootstrap? How is it added to Angular? Now, Bootstrap is a powerful toolkit. It is a collection of basic HTML, CSS, and JavaScript tools for creating and building responsive web applications. There are two ways to embed Bootstrap libraries. First up is using the Bootstrap CDN, which is the Content Delivery Network. Now, this enables users to load the CSS and JavaScript files remotely from its servers. The other way is to use Angular Bootstrap via NPM. Now, this is used to add Bootstrap to your Angular project by installing it into your project folder. Now, you can use commands like npm install bootstrap and npm install jQuery to install them for your project. If you wish to learn Bootstrap in detail, I highly suggest you check out our video on Angular Bootstrap. The tutorial explains how to embed Bootstrap and use it to create and good-looking Angular applications. What is eager and lazy loading? Eager loading is the default module loading strategy. Now, all the feature modules under eager loading are loaded before your application even starts. This is typically used for small size applications since lesser modules are used. All of these modules are loaded initially, which makes running of these kind of applications extremely fast. When it comes to lazy loading, all the loading happens dynamically. all feature modules are loaded on demand. It is used for bigger applications where the modules are not required at the start of applications. This makes the application faster since no time is spent on loading unnecessary modules. Next up, what type of DOM does Angular implement? DOM, or Document Object Model, treats an XML or HTML document as a tree structure in which each node is an object representing a part of the document. Now, Angular uses the regular DOM. This updates the entire tree structure of HTML tags until it reaches the data that has to be updated. Now, to ensure that the speed and performance are not affected, Angular implements something called as the change detection. Next up, how is dependency injection achieved in Angular? Now, dependencies are objects or services that a component needs to perform functions, correct? Now, with the help of dependency injection, these classes can request dependencies from external sources rather than creating them on their own. Here I've created a service called demo service using the command ng service demo service, and I've also added the small snippet of code when you create that service. Now these services can be injected to your main component and perform various functions. Next up, how does Angular routing work? Now, I'm sure you must have observed that the URL changes every time you click on your user interface on an application, correct? Every time you navigate through the application or move from one page to another, the URL changes. Now, this means that the application is being routed or you're navigating through the application. So basically, routing helps navigate through a web application, especially in case of single page applications. Now, as discussed earlier, single page applications are loaded just once. So any new content that is being displayed is just a mere addition. It's not being loaded again. So routing plays a vital role in case of single page applications. Typically, it is specified with the help of the / and followed by a path that defines the new content. Now, I'm just taking the same example that I took before. This was the example for string interpolation. However, you can see that we have a navigation bar here with 4 different options for that is home, about, services and login. And for home and login, I've created a path and added routing to it. So when I click on the home icon, you can see that some content is being displayed onto the screen. And if you observe, you can see that there is a / with the path name home here, which indicates that routing has occurred. Same with login. When I click on it, the path changes and the login page appears. If you wish to learn the concept of routing, I suggest you check out a video. The tutorial explains routing in detail. Moving on, what are form control and form groups? Now, a form control is basically a class that enables validation. For each input field, an instance of this class is created. And these instances help check the values of the field and see if they are touched, untouched, dirty, pristine, valid, invalid, or so on. So for every field in the form, the data that is being provided is validated with the help of these controls. If it is dirty, it means that the value has been changed. If the data provided holds good for a particular condition, then the control is said to be valid, and so on. With the help of these controls, you can determine if the value provided is legitimate or not. This can be achieved with the help of form control. When it comes to form group, and the form group class represents a group of controls. Now, a form can have multiple control groups. The form group class returns true if all the controls are valid and also provides validation errors if any. Next up is how is testing achieved in Angular. Now, Angular uses Jasmine to run various tests. The Jasmine framework allows various functionalities to write different kinds of test cases. The task runner for these tests is typically Karma, and Karma uses a configuration file to set the startup, reporters, and the testing framework. Next question is, what is package.json? Now npm installs package.json when a new workspace is created. Now this file includes a starter set of packages, some of which are required by Angular. Now typically it's organized into two groups. One is dependencies. These are essential to run your applications. And we have dev dependencies. These are essential to develop applications. So with that, we come to the end of this video. I hope it helped you get a good hold of Angular fundamentals. If you have any doubts or queries, let us know in the comment section below. Thank you so much for being here and watch out for more videos from us. Until then, keep learning and stay tuned to Simplilearn.